A black person is less likely to pay off his loan than a white person. A man deserves to apply for and get the job of a higher paid position than a woman. Before you pick up that phone and dial 999 to report me for all of these racist and sexist comments, let me tell you, these are not my opinions at all. These are in fact decisions that have been made by artificial intelligence in the past. Welcome to yet another episode of ABTV's Crossfire Debate, and today we will be discussing the existence of bias in artificial intelligence and if it impacts businesses.
The questions that we're asking are rubbish questions.
I cannot imagine how mathematics can be biased. I would not agree that financial system is in such a bad situation.
Really? There's
because
a billion
if you put
people
yourself
that don't have a bank account.
Not my responsibility to identify bias in data.
Welcome back to the show. I have a two-part question for the audience here. First, how many of y'all think that AI bias exists? Show of hands. Second part of this question is, how many think that it affects and impacts businesses today? Is that like a 99%? All right. All right, great. In the studios right now, we have Harvey Bennett, who thinks AI bias exists and does impact businesses. And we also have Pavel Nesterov, who thinks AI bias exists but doesn't really impact businesses. Thanks so much for joining us. So before we start the show, let me just pull out this stat for you. Only 12% of leading machine learning researchers are women. Majority of leading machine learning researchers are Caucasian men. So then my question to you is, because of this stat on screen, do you think AI thinks like a white man, Harvey?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look, we're quite lucky in the work that we do. We have two of the people included in this 12% that work with us in our team. So part of the reason for that is because when we were approaching the problem that we're tackling, which is who are the right people or the most appropriate people for specific teams, we were super conscious of the potential for our own biases and prejudice to bleed into some of the decisions that our machine was making.
Right.
And if you extrapolate that outwards, I think we were fairly forward-thinking with our approach on that. But if you extrapolate it outwards without having that mindset, then it's inevitable that all of the biases, the subconscious biases particularly, which all of us are carrying around, that we don't realize we're carrying around, are going to bleed into the work that you're doing in machine learning.
Of course. So inventions tend to favor their creator, correct? So now, do you agree that because of this really pitiful statistic that we have, is that one of the reasons why AI is biased?
I don't agree that this number can affect the bias. So first of all, it contradicts my prior experience, this number. Because when I've been teaching in Moscow State University, 35% of my students were women. In our
only a bit higher than 12%.
But still, it's more than twice. So in our online course, we have 40% of participants who are women. Then I would distinguish AI algorithms and everything else. AI algorithms are about mathematics and about optimization. And we are talking about now about researches of AI. And we should take into account academic integrity, so that people, they are committed to be honest and do not introduce any bias. So either we do not agree that academic integrity exists, then whole science is failed.
But
it's not about integrity though, is it?
Yeah, but they cannot...
A subconscious bias that we're not aware of when we're carrying it around isn't... By betraying that doesn't make us not have integrity, right?
But this is mathematics.
How can machine learning and AI is more than that. There are three core foundational pillars to AI. There's maths, and the algorithms. Yeah. There's the data, and then there's the processing power. If one of those three things is corrupted by any kind of bias, then fundamentally the output, which we're calling AI here, but should really be a business output, then it's fundamentally corrupted.
But these people, they do not work on a data. So they take data from human experience. And it's said to say but humanity is biased.
But before we get to the hows and whys of it, I just need to pull out these 3 case studies that we have. And you know what? Let's just play a game. So I'll read out one of these cases, and you tell me if you think this is an AI bias or not. So the first one is in May 2016, the US news organization ProPublica reported that COMPAS is racially biased. So for those of you who don't know, COMPAS is basically a criminal sentencing algorithm. So a lot of data has been put in, including the background of the criminals, repeat offenders, etc., on the basis of which AI computes the probability of them committing a crime one more time. So in this case, this accusation, do you think that is an example of AI bias, Harvey?
Yeah, I would say that, again, if you take the 3 core foundational pillars of AI, yeah, there's definitely bias, which is a consequence, like you rightly said, I think, of our human biases that exists, right? And if, you've got poor people who are being sentenced to extreme penalties and punishments because of the way that the judicial system and penal system is structured, then of course that's going to bleed into the results that you get from
Right, but then in this case, I did go through the report. It was quite a detailed report, but most of the data that was put in was objective. So you had numbers, you had figures, you had statistics of the crimes and the criminals and the repeat offenders. So won't this just be an example of probability and not bias?
The judicial system is already biased in the way that it's created. It's there to represent the wealthy and the white predominantly when it was first created, depending on which country you're coming from. And so as a consequence of that, where there was bias before, if we don't do something to fundamentally correct that, then the bias will continue into the future. Doesn't matter whether you're using a machine or a human to do it. If it's set up in the wrong way in the first place, nothing you can do will change it.
Right. Pavel, first case, do you think it is an example of AI bias or not?
So I again would not agree that this is an example of AI bias. And for me, one passage from the report from ProPublica is enough to believe it. So they asked several judges about how did they use this system to make decisions, and all of them, at least who they asked, and they knew who to put to the report. So all of them, they've said that we used this score to determine a period of a person to be in a jail. Then you can open a manual for of the authors of the COMPAS, how to use it. And they explicitly say that this system should not be used to determine final sentence to an offender. So this system should be used to determine probation period after person is free.
Right.
So for me, it is example of judges. How it was being used doesn't affect whether or not the solution was producing an output that was unfairly representing or misrepresenting certain population groups.
Also, just coming back to the question is, do you think what happened here, COMPAS, is racially biased, and is that an example of AI bias? So not about the final verdict, but just this case of the software.
I would say that we should consider whole business case. So business case is to evaluate a person, to understand the probability of him to make a repeated crime. So the business case is a single, but not just an AI system.
Okay, interesting. Just moving on to the second one now. Financial algorithms for predicting loan repayment are regularly accused of being racially biased. Pavel, I'll start with you. Is this an example?
Again, partially it is biased, but I would say that such things should be regulated by the government. For example, in US, for scoring systems, for the most elder group, you cannot give lower score than for the previous group. This is done to protect the most elder group. So yes, this can, again, as a use case, we would observe bias in this, but this bias can be easily fixed with such simple rules.
Right, so if you're talking about these rules, historically what has been happening in especially the US is Hispanic and Black people have been underbanked, and this has been proven, and they've also not been provided mortgages and loans because of the prejudices present in the system. So now this data that has been happening, which is wrong, has been fed into the system. So then won't this be a case of human bias passed on to AI?
Yeah.
Yes, Harvey.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, the financial services system is fundamentally broken at the moment. We wouldn't be going through this, what do they call it, digital transformation and fintech banking and all of this nonsense, words that we use frequently to describe the evolution of banking towards something which is fundamentally tech first. We wouldn't be going through that if it was all roses, you know? So there are two things there, and I kind of almost would lean in your direction. I think you've got a really tough argument to make, by the way, but I'd almost lean a little bit in your direction by saying that these biases were already present here before. The issue, in order to solve the issue, it's not about removing the bias that bleeds into the algorithm. It's actually about addressing the biases that existed previously and identifying ways of minimizing or removing them entirely.
Right, so this is one of the solutions you're proposing. My problem with that solution is we'll probably discuss this a little bit later. So are you trying to say that we need to change data, manipulate data, because what's been happening in the past wasn't right, but then you're just feeding it in? I mean,
the questions that we're asking are rubbish questions.
Oh.
Or not your questions. I mean, sorry.
All right.
Sorry, Shruti. No, I don't mean that. What I mean is the questions that businesses are asking themselves when we talk about business objectives. The business objectives and the business questions that we're trying to tackle and that we're trying to ask ourselves are just fundamentally rubbish because we're asking the wrong ones. We're asking something which is fueled by capitalism, which in essence then creates another bias on top of the already biases that we carry around with us, because the objective is to fundamentally serve the stakeholders, who are obviously a minority group, but they have all of the control and all of the power. So inevitably, we're going to end up creating systems which favor a handful of people instead of the majority of people.
Agreed.
I would not agree that financial system is in such a bad situation.
Really? There's
because
a billion people that don't have a bank account.
If you put yourself to a bank, so you want to maximize your profitability, you can do whatever you want until it violates a law. It's not a goal of the business to change life of a people.
That's the problem with capitalism.
Government and science society, it's their goal to make people's life better. So scientists should work on this problem. They should learn how to eliminate this bias from the data, and the government should follow them and issue new laws. But business has just to follow this law and do whatever they want to make.
And that is perhaps the second part of the debate, which we will get at some point, because obviously businesses are about profitability and they're not really about fairness.
Biases that you end up creating by having a capitalist system versus a sustainable system, right? A system which is fundamentally governed by the triple bottom line, for example. In the capitalist system, it's how do I add value to my stakeholders? Nothing matters except the value I generate for them. In the sustainability system, it's how do I generate value for my stakeholders, help the community that are around me, and don't damage or do good for the planet. Now, this system over here is thinking about things in a very different way to this system over here, which means that the outputs and the biases we create over here are fundamentally different to the ones over here. So the question maybe isn't, is it biased? The question, as I went on about earlier, is maybe, are we asking the wrong questions in the first place because we're leaning towards this capitalism thing instead of another alternative way of doing it?
But again, you're talking about the evolution of a society in general. So that might...
That's what this is going to do.
But that's not a short-term solution for now, at least. It's not going to happen in the short term. But let's just cover the third point for now. Google's online advertising system showed high-income jobs to men much more often than to women. Harvey, is this an example of AI bias or not?
Yes. And also a bias in society. I mean, it's a crime against not just women, but humanity, the number of females that occupy kind of C-level or senior level roles is just ridiculous. I was completely unaware of it, actually, because I just didn't even know it existed until the last few years as it's been coming out more and more and the light is well and truly being shone on it.
With regards to just this example specifically, can this not be targeted advertising? I'm not saying this is right, but this is probably the problem of the HR manager.
Okay, so this is a great example of a subconscious bias, right?
Yeah.
So women and men respond differently to different uses of words, different vocabulary. For example, he's less likely to be put off by words like aggressive, dominating, winning, owning, Whereas you are going to find those subconsciously as a kind of general rule. The probability suggests that you are going to find words like that, something as kind of warning signals that make you steer away from it. So yeah, perhaps it's an advertising thing, but then there's the keywords that were selected. If it was an advertising thing, the person who selected the keywords was implementing their own bias into the thing.
But but that won't be AI bias, right? That is a person's bias. I'll give you an example. So this is something that I do when I handle my YouTube account. If I'm doing a topic on the GCC's recruitment market, I would target it to the GCC, and I wouldn't expect somebody from Dublin to tune into that video. So I'm doing it consciously, but I'm doing it manually.
Sure, but then there's the algorithm that sits behind that decides whether or not to show an ad based on the search query which was created by the person searching for it. So Google has different kinds of match types for the keywords that you buy. If you put it on what's called broad match, then I could put a target keyword could be glass, and then you could go and search for sunglasses, and you'd still see an ad related to my glass.
Right.
Because Google's algorithm has decided that there's a relationship, or probably a relationship, between sunglasses and glass.
Okay, interesting. What do you think, Pavel?
Yeah, I will give you another example in the context of your answer, because which will show the complexity, and it is also related to Google. So one lady from AI Now Institute from New York University, she's a co-director there. So she tried to use Google image search to count number of so she used the query CEO in US.
Yes.
And
facial recognition.
Yeah, and she tried to count ratio of women returned to this query. So the ratio was 11%. The prior number, so real number of women CEO in US is 27%. So the question is, what should Google return? 11, 27, or 50?
Right.
If you think that it should return 50, then it is a discrimination against men. If we think that it should return 27, which is fair number, then we should fix all possible queries which we send to Google, which is infinite number of queries.
Right.
Which is also not possible.
Right. So now let's just get to the hows and whys of it. Now, exactly what you're talking about. If you're looking at it as a three-step process, there's probably framing the problem, there's collecting the data, and there's preparing the data eventually. So how exactly, as AI experts here, how would you frame the problem when you're trying to input something into an AI system?
First of all, the data, we have no power to change the past. So we just collect data from the past and we train our model on this data. So we just have no power to change this. So we can fix most popular cases with color, skin, with gender, with something else. We can fix it. But we should always remember that whenever we fix this, we violate one rule of machine learning. You should not change output of machine learning system. So a business should understand that whenever they try to fix such bias, they lose money.
There's this whole debate or war between fairness and accuracy, right? So in terms of accuracy, this has been happening in the past, and that is exactly the data that has been fed into the system, but that's not fair because that's what's been happening in the past isn't really right. So coming to the business case of it, businesses are going to prefer accuracy over fairness, right? So then would you say AI has a direct impact on businesses?
I would say that AI is inevitably going to have a direct impact on every single business. It already is today. You know, anyone that's spending any advertising money digitally through any Facebook product or Google product is fundamentally being affected by artificial intelligence already, because it's an AI algorithm which is defining whether or not your ad is going to be served and which audience it's going to be served to, at what time and which location, how frequently. So you're already being impacted by it. from a marketing perspective, which is then going to have an impact on your revenue, because if you don't get the eyeballs, you don't get the sales, because you can't have the conversation if you don't have someone's attention.
Right. And how about you? So when you're talking about the bias, do you think AI bias affects businesses?
So I would say that it is not AI bias who affects business. Society affects business. Society can force government to change law. Government changes law and it affects business. Society itself is a power, but AI, as I've said at the beginning, it is just a set of mathematical algorithms. They have no free will. They cannot change anything.
They have human designs. It's a fundamentally human endeavor, right? So if we were all perfectly perfect, then the results that you get from the maths would be great.
Are you talking about algorithms or data behind?
Well, we said already there are three things, but fundamentally the error is in the design, right?
Design of algorithms or design of a whole system?
The design of the algorithm and
can you give at least one example how algorithm can be biased?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the things that you are looking for, or I can give you a cause of it, because the questions you are asking it to answer, the things that you are looking for as an output are already biased by design, because you don't understand the impact.
You said that there are several pillars of AI. One of them algorithms, one of them data.
Yeah.
Algorithms in isolation can be biased or not.
So already we had one example over here where we were talking about the Amazon hiring problem.
Yes, and the reason is data.
And the algorithm.
How?
Because if the algorithm is discounting...
For a mathematician, I cannot imagine how mathematics can be biased.
No, mathematics can't be biased.
But algorithms is nothing more but mathematics.
But in principle, yes, I completely agree with you. But not when you're looking for an outcome. The mathematics in this case is being used to answer a question, and the question is fundamentally flawed.
Right now, after this conversation that we've had in the last 15 or 20 minutes, we've established that AI bias does exist. We also know that there is this sort of tug of war between fairness, accuracy, and business. And finally, we've also discovered that there is no formula or solution when it comes to this problem, because we're talking about data that's age-old, like that's come from generations now. So keeping all of this in mind, just park that in your mind. Let me just pull this out first. AI could contribute $15.7 trillion to global economy by 2030. And 25% of senior executives say they plan to fundamentally reimagine their businesses with AI by 2021, and 54% will use AI to transform processes. So you see that there is a huge shift happening towards AI in most of the companies around the world. So now that we don't really have a concrete solution to solve this problem of AI bias, do you think this should happen? Do you think this huge scale move towards AI needs to happen right now?
Well, look, two things. Number one is there are suites of tools that exist to try and help you identify biases in the data and the outputs that you're receiving from your model. So if you're interested, we should go and look at some of those from IBM.
But can it eliminate it completely?
It's on us. As a data scientist, it is the responsibility of that data scientist to identify those patterns and try to work out ways of removing them from the data.
Right. Pavel, you are a data scientist. Do you think it is realistically possible to do that in the next 2 years?
It's not my responsibility to identify bias in data because it is not correlated with the goal of data scientists, because the goal is optimization. Whenever, as you said, there is no one single solution, and we should work together, business, science, and governments, to find a point where there will be a synergy between all of us, when goal of a business, which is profitability, which would be correlated with others parties. So then but still, I cannot answer where is this point.
But are you not talking like a businessman then now? If you're talking about profitability, you said it, that science and government should speak about fairness over profitability.
I'm working for business. My goal is to make business better. But for business, better is to increase profitability.
And you think right now, when the world is moving towards a more socially responsible, sustainable society,
yes,
this is going to be a good business case for you?
Yes, it is exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, that if government with science community will issue such laws where me and the business, we would be forced to follow this rule, I would be happy to follow them. For me, as a human being, I would prefer to eliminate as more bias as possible. But still, I'm working for my client, and his goal is to maximize profitability. I cannot force him to follow my moral concepts.
Right. So AI bias, according to you, then, is affecting the society but is not impacting businesses. Just coming back in closing.
I would say that, yeah, almost, but society is affecting business, not AI is affecting business.
All right, great. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, but we do have time for some audience Q&A. So is there anyone with a question for us two speakers here?
There are a lot of countries who's actually implementing systems as to they would be seeing your acts by monitoring your daily activity and see if you would be a criminal as to you cannot be one, but then that is destabilizing the society at large, the way we have been thinking freely over time. So what do you think? Like, is it going to affect this at large? And should AI be implemented for such things?
I mean, firstly, it's a really interesting space, that whole kind of like, not just the pre-crime bit, the predictive analytics piece in general is a really interesting bit. So you got the data acquisition part of it, which is an interesting part as well, but then you've also got the moral side of it. Do we want to be living in an Orwellian society which is fundamentally governed and monitored, and we don't have any of the freedoms that we're kind of losing at the moment, I think, a little bit. We're volunteering those freedoms away. We're exchanging them for convenience and consumerism, which is a choice that we're making as a society based on the information and data that we have available to us. And then you've got the tech part of it, which is really interesting. And you look at countries like China that have been very, very good at gathering and acquiring data from the people that live there. And some of the actions that they're trying to take and some of the things that they're trying to predict and some of the ways they're trying to use that data. I think, technically it's possible. Whether it's something that we should be doing or not, I think is a completely much more important question.
So again, we're getting into the solutions for it, but that's probably a conversation for another time. Any other question for our speakers here?
Yeah. So it seems to me it was more of a philosophical conversation than more of just an AI-based conversation. So I think it took more of a ideological side and a cold, hard mathematics side. So how do you think that these two sides are going to come together within the public perception? Because I think this conversation is actually happening across the board, outside in the public, more of a cultural Marxist, oppressed oppressor side with a more cold, hard mathematics side. And how do you think we can actually bridge the gap between those two sides? More for Pavel.
Yeah, again, it sounds like philosophical discussion because there is no solution. Mm-hmm. So in machine learning, there is such thing which is called exploration versus exploitation. So whenever we see such cases, we are observing exploitation of the data. Mm-hmm. But we try to introduce to machine learning model such things like exploration. So, for example, there is a model which is called multi-armed bandits. So it does not forget about minorities. So again, this model is used to rotate advertisement online. Mm-hmm. So it is implicitly programmed not to forget about minorities. So it shows. For white people, it shows expensive houses. For black people, it still shows cheap houses. But still, sometimes it tries, okay, let me show this to this group, let me show this to this group. And this algorithm essentially is ready to this point, because whenever it would see that this group reacts better to a more expensive advertisement, then it starts showing them more and more and more. So this mathematics is fair. What is not fair is a history. So if you want to change something, let's start from education. Let's start from, ethic lessons in the school.
Right, but the good news is there are companies right now who are addressing these issues. For example, IBM, I think they're working on an automated bias detection software. So there are solutions coming where AI is trying to eliminate the bias that is being created already. I'm just going to ask you this question one more time, the same two questions I asked again. After this discussion, how many of you all think, again, AI bias exists? Oh, all
I
right.
wasn't convinced at the start either. So.
Interesting. And now the second question, does it impact businesses? All right, great. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for those brilliant insights. And thank you for watching ABTV's Crossfire. If you liked today's episode, then hit that like button. And if you want to participate in ABTV's Crossfire Debate, then drop your email ID in the comment box below. And I promise I will get back to you. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel.